Chasing a Ghost, Bix Beiderbecke and the Lost Sound of the Jazz Age. There's a story that begins along the Mississippi River in Davenport, in a quiet neighborhood where one of the most influential musicians in American history grew up. And yet for someone whose sound would ripple across generations, shaping the way jazz would be played, heard, and understood, we are still left with a question that has never been fully answered. Who was Bix Beiderbecke? More than a century later, even with all the recordings and all the photographs, and even with the memories left behind by those who knew him, he remains just out of reach, like a figure you can hear clearly, but never quite see in full. He was born in 1903 into a respectable Davenport family in a household that valued structure, discipline, and reputation. The Beiderbeckes were established. His father, Bismarck Beiderbecke, was a successful businessman in coal and lumber, tied into the economic and social fabric of Davenport at a time when those industries helped define the city itself. His family moved in circles that valued reputation, stability, and quiet influence. This was not a household built around risk or experimentation. It was built around maintaining a place in a changing world. And it was a world that was changing quickly. Bix was born into a German-American family at a moment when that identity was becoming complicated. By the time he reached his teenage years, the United States had entered World War I, and anti-German sentiment spread across the country, including in places like Davenport that had once openly embraced German culture. Language, traditions, even names began to be softened or hidden. Families like the Beiderbeckes adapted. They became more cautious, more focused on fitting in than standing out. Stability meant protection, and that pressure shaped the expectations placed on Bix from an early age. He was supposed to follow a path that made sense, a path that kept the family standing intact, a path that avoided attention. But almost immediately he began drifting away from it. At home, the emotional landscape was uneven. His mother, Agatha, recognized something in him and offered quiet support, even if she didn't fully understand the music that had taken hold of him. His father, on the other hand, remained distant, formal, and often disapproving. The gap between them never really closed. Bix felt that absence. After he left Davenport, he wrote home constantly, letter after letter, trying to explain himself, trying to be understood, trying to earn something that always seemed just out of reach. Beneath those letters lurked a need for approval that never fully came. It may explain why, even later, when he was surrounded by musicians and moving through some of the most important bands of the era, he remained strangely unanchored. He formed connections, but rarely lasting ones. There were a small number of relationships with women, brief and uncertain. Some later historians have speculated about his private life, but if there were truths there, they remained hidden. Friends mentioned that he was guarded, as if he was always holding something back, always keeping a distance. Nothing about his early life suggested what was coming. There was no formal training that pointed toward greatness, no carefully planned path into music. In fact, one of the most remarkable things about Bix was that he couldn't read music, relying instead on an instinct that seemed almost impossible to explain, an ability to hear something once and then recreate it, not as a copy, but as something refined, controlled, and entirely his own. And then, sometime around the end of 1918, his whole world changed. His older brother, Bernie, returned home to Davenport after serving stateside during World War I. He brought a Victrola phonograph and several records, including Tiger Rag and Skeleton Jangle by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, one of the first big jazz bands. That was the first time Bix heard jazz, and it took over his world. He became obsessed with those records, playing them over and over until he wore them out. He taught himself to play cornet by following the horn lines of Nick LaRocca, replaying them over and over, internalizing the phrasing, the timing, the sound. The Mississippi was also right there. Riverboats came through constantly, carrying musicians with them and bringing the sound north in real time. Bix would go down to the river, listening, absorbing, chasing something he didn't yet have a name for. There are accounts that Louis Armstrong and drummer Baby Dodds may have encountered him when their boat stopped in Davenport, though historians still debate whether that meeting actually happened. By the time he was a teenager, Bix had already crossed a line. He had heard something that didn't exist in the world he had been raised in, and he couldn't unhear it. He began to skip school, making his way down to Bucktown, to stand near riverboats, to hear something he couldn't find anywhere else. And that is where the real story of Bix begins. Because Bix didn't just leave Davenport to chase music, he left because the life expected of him and the life he was beginning to live could not coexist. But even as he stepped into that world, there were limits. Jazz in the early 1920s was segregated. Black musicians created the music, defined it, shaped it, but white musicians and black musicians never performed together in professional settings. The industry, the venues, the audiences, all of it was divided. At the same time, musicians often crossed those lines privately, listening, learning, and sometimes playing together in late-night jam sessions and speakeasies outside the formal structure of the industry. Bix and Louis Armstrong played together privately in Chicago, but these collaborations remained largely hidden from public view. Bix listened closely to black musicians. He sought them out. He studied their sound. But he could not fully participate in that world. He was confined to white bands. That meant that even as he absorbed the deepest influences of the music, there were limits on how he could express it, where he could play it, and who he could play it with. And that growing divide between who he was expected to be and who he was becoming didn't stay contained. In April of 1921, just a month after he turned 18, Bix was arrested in Davenport, charged with a serious accusation. According to police records, a 5-year-old girl named Sarah Ivins claimed that he had taken her into a neighbor's garage and acted inappropriately with her. The police ledger states that the two were inside a car in the garage where he closed the door. The girl cried out, drawing the attention of 2 young men across the street. Those men approached, the moment broke, and the girl ran home. The following day, the 2 young men told her father that they had seen Beiderbecke take her into the garage. The girl accused him of putting his hands on her person outside of her dress. Bix was arrested shortly after and released on a $1,500 bond. From there, the case moved toward a grand jury, but almost immediately the situation began to shift. Sarah's father requested that the charge be dropped, citing the harm it would cause his daughter to go through the case publicly. By September of 1921, the grand jury returned no indictment, and the county attorney formally dismissed the case. Even in the official record, there are uncertainties. It is not entirely clear whether the girl herself directly identified Bix in a formal proceeding. The documentation that survives is limited, and the incident remained largely unknown for decades. What is clear is how it was handled, quietly, contained, and managed in a way that protected both his and his family's reputation. It was about removing him from Davenport, from scrutiny, from a situation the family could not afford to have linger. He was sent to Lake Forest Academy near Chicago by his parents in an attempt to bring structure back into his life. But the opposite happened instead, as he skipped classes to visit the jazz clubs throughout Chicago, playing constantly. Eventually he was expelled. After that, there was no returning to the path that had been planned for him. By the early 1920s, he was fully committed to music, joining local groups and then moving into more serious professional work, including time with the Wolverines Jazz Orchestra, where in 1924 he made his first recordings, cutting songs like Fidgety Feet and Riverboat Shuffle. Even in those early takes, something about his playing stood apart. It was the way he approached sound itself. At a time when many jazz musicians were pushing forward with volume, speed, and expressive intensity, Bix did something different, shaping his tone so that it was clean, centered, and almost luminous, often described as bell-like, with a smoothness that removed any sense of strain, and a phrasing style that felt deliberate, almost architectural, as if each note had been placed exactly where it needed to be. One musician said it sounded like a girl saying yes. But beyond tone and control, there was something else that set him apart. His playing felt like a conversation. It was something unfolding in real time, phrases that responded to each other, lines that seemed to listen as much as they spoke. Where earlier jazz leaned on energy and momentum, Bix introduced space, restraint, and clarity. It was so different from what had come before that other musicians immediately took notice, and many of them began to copy it. Bix himself once tried to explain what drew him to the music in the first place. "I'd go to hell to hear a good band," he said, a line that captured not just enthusiasm but something closer to compulsion, a willingness to follow the sound wherever it led, no matter the cost. And when he talked about the music itself, he often described it in terms that reflected its unpredictability. He once told a friend, "One thing I like about jazz, kid, is that I don't know what's going to happen next." Do you? It wasn't structure that drew him in, it was the unknown, the moment before the next note. That way of thinking shaped how he played. For Bix, jazz wasn't about perfection, it was about feeling. The wrong note played with confidence could carry more weight than the right note played with hesitation. Mistakes weren't something to avoid, they were part of the process. If you weren't making them, you weren't pushing far enough. And the best moments, the ones people remembered, came when thinking stopped altogether and feeling took over. By the mid-1920s, his most important recordings began to take shape. In 1925, he recorded Davenport Blues, a piece that carried the name of his hometown and offered one of the earliest clear examples of his style, controlled, lyrical, and unmistakably his own. Around the same time, recordings like Clarinet Marmalade showed how he could move within an ensemble while still shaping the sound around him. But it was in 1927 that his defining work emerged. With Frankie Trumbauer, he recorded Singin' the Blues, a performance built not on volume or speed, but on control, tone, and space. His cornet lines moved with a calm precision that stood apart from everything else in jazz at the time, and the recording would go on to influence generations of musicians who heard in it a completely different way of approaching the music. Sax player-writer Benny Green said of Bix, "When a musician hears Bix's solo on Singing the Blues, he becomes aware after 2 bars that the soloist knows exactly what he is doing and that he has an exquisite sense of discord and resolution. He knows also that this player is endowed with the rarest jazz gift of all, a sense of form which lends to an improvised performance a coherence which no amount of teaching can produce." That same year he recorded In a Mist, a piano composition that revealed another side of his musical mind, drawing on impressionistic harmonies and structures that extended far beyond traditional jazz. Together, these recordings formed the core of his legacy. From there, his career accelerated quickly. He joined the Gene Goldkette Orchestra in 1925, one of the leading dance bands of the era, where he refined his role within a larger ensemble, earning a lot of money for the time, but also stepping into a life defined by travel, late nights, and constant performance. Other musicians took notice. Louis Armstrong recognized him as one of the finest players of the era. Others described his sound as something entirely different from what they were used to hearing. A tone that didn't push outward, but seemed to draw listeners in, creating a sense of calm inside music that was otherwise expanding rapidly in all directions. Hoagy Carmichael, one of the most successful songwriters of the time, said of Bix, "His music affected me in a different way. Can't tell you how, like licorice, you have to eat some." Bix occupied a unique place in the jazz world, standing between the raw energy of early jazz pioneers and the more controlled, introspective styles that would come later, influencing both while fully belonging to neither. But for Bix, the music was never casual. It was an obsession, not something he did, something he chased, something he couldn't turn off. Even as he moved into bigger bands and more structured environments, that obsession never softened. If anything, it intensified. And the life around it demanded everything. By the time he joined Paul Whiteman's orchestra in 1927, the pace became relentless. The band traveled constantly, often by overnight train, performing 7 days a week, frequently playing 2 shows a day. There was little time to eat, little time to sleep, and almost no privacy. Many of the musicians drank heavily. Bix did too. The work was so demanding that, as one musician later put it, you almost had to drink. And for Bix, drinking didn't remain social or occasional. It became structural. By the late 1920s, accounts from those around him consistently described consumption that reached staggering levels, often as much as 3 pints of hard alcohol a day. Not spread casually across a night, but consumed as a way to keep going, to take the edge off the exhaustion, the pressure, the repetition. And musically, the work could feel limiting. The same arrangements night after night, broken only by brief moments of improvisation. Those brief openings were where he came alive. But the rest of it, the schedules, the travel, the expectations, pressed in from all sides. There are accounts of Bix sleeping on the bandstand between solos, stepping forward only when it was his turn to play. In one surviving score, someone had written a simple instruction. "Wake up, Bix." By that point, the drinking was no longer just part of the environment. It was something he was trying unsuccessfully to manage. There were attempts to stop, attempts to reset. He was sent more than once to what would have been considered rest cures at the time, early forms of rehabilitation, sanitariums, quiet facilities, places designed to remove a person from alcohol, from the city, from the routine that had taken hold. For a short time it worked. Away from the band, away from the constant motion, his health would begin to stabilize. The drinking would stop, or at least slow. He would regain weight. His playing, when he returned to it, could briefly recover its clarity. But those recoveries never held. After these stays, he would often return home, back to Davenport or to familiar surroundings, to convalesce, to rest, to regain his strength. And almost as soon as that structure fell away, the pattern resumed. The drinking returned quickly, sometimes immediately, as if nothing had interrupted it at all. It wasn't a dramatic collapse each time. It was quieter than that. A cycle. Stop. Recover. Return. Drink again. And slowly something gave way. On November 30th, 1928, while on tour in Cleveland, Bix suffered what contemporaries described as a severe nervous crisis. Some later historians believe it was an acute attack of delirium tremors, likely triggered when he tried to suddenly curb his drinking. The result was violent and unmistakable. As trombonist Bill Rank put it, "He cracked up, that's all. Just went to pieces, broke up a room full of furniture in the hotel." It was not just exhaustion, it was collapse. From that point on, everything changed. A month or so before the end, there had already been another unraveling. He drifted in and out of jobs, missing rehearsals, unable to sustain even short engagements. Bands that once depended on him could no longer count on him to appear, let alone perform at the level that had made him indispensable. There were attempts to steady him. Friends intervened. His family brought him home more than once, hoping rest might restore him. There were stays in rehabilitation, periods where he was pulled away from the road, away from the clubs, away from alcohol. For a time it would seem to work. He would regain some strength, some clarity. And then, almost inevitably, the cycle would begin again. By the summer of 1931, he was no longer part of the center of the jazz world he had helped define. The music was changing, bigger bands, new structures, a different energy taking hold. And he could feel it, that sense that the world he had helped shape was moving forward without him. That is part of what brought him to Queens. He wasn't there because it was where the action was. He was there because it wasn't. It was quieter, removed, a place where he could disappear. The apartment itself came through the help of others, people who still cared about him, who were trying to give him some kind of footing when he could no longer provide it for himself. Inside that apartment, his world narrowed. No ballrooms, no recording sessions, no trains cutting through the night. Just long, indistinct days, and crippling isolation. drinking that had shifted from social to necessary, less about celebration, more about survival or something like it. Physically, he was in terrible shape. Years of drinking combined with exhaustion and nervous strain had left his body depleted. His ability to recover from illness was compromised. Mentally, there were clear signs of strain, anxiety, paranoia, moments where reality began to slip. And then came August 6, 1931. It was a hot, muggy day in a Queens apartment building. One of the tenants suddenly burst into the hallway, screaming, demanding to see the building's rental agent, George Kraslow. When Kraslow reached apartment 1G, he found the tenant trembling in the middle of the room, insisting that two Mexican men were hiding under his bed with long daggers. To calm him, Kraslow bent down to check. There was nothing there. And as he rose back up, the tenant collapsed into his arms. A doctor who lived in the building was rushed in, but there was nothing to be done. The tenant was already dead. That tenant was Bix Beiderbecke. He was just 28 years old. The official cause of death was lobar pneumonia. But that diagnosis only explains the final moment, not the condition that led to it. Most historians agree that acute alcoholism played a central role in the rapid decline of his physical and mental health during that final year. By some accounts, he had only been in that apartment for a month or two, rarely leaving except to buy bootleg gin. And in that sense, his story was not entirely unique. The jazz world of that era, brilliant, innovative, relentless, carried a pattern of self-destruction alongside its creativity. Figures like Charlie Parker, Lester Young, and Fats Navarro would all face similar battles, each in their own way overtaken by the same forces that seemed at times inseparable from the music itself. In Bix's case, everything converged at once. By the time pneumonia set in, there was very little left to fight it. And the timing only deepened the loss. Because just as jazz was expanding into something larger, something that would define an era, one of its most original voices was already gone, having slipped out of the world he helped create before it fully understood what it had. Because his death came at the very end of the jazz age, just as that entire era was beginning to fade, it's as if his life and that moment in American culture had been moving together and then ended together. And with that ending, the way he was remembered began to take shape. He became one of the earliest examples of something that would later become familiar in popular music, the brilliant figure who burns out too quickly, whose life ends before it can fully explain itself, leaving behind just enough to suggest greatness, but not enough to define it completely. The idea of Bix as a tortured genius, a musician whose gifts were undeniable, but whose life could not sustain them, grew out of that absence, shaped as much by what was missing as by what remained. One musician later said that Bix killed a lot of people by creating the template for the tortured genius, gone too soon. Back in Davenport, the place where it all began still exists, with the river continuing its steady path, and the sense that somewhere within that setting is the beginning of a story that no one at the time could have fully understood. Not a legend or a myth, but a young man who heard something different, left everything familiar behind to follow it, and in doing so created a sound that would outlast him. Because the music is still here. Clear, balanced, unmistakable. But the person behind it never fully resolved into something we can easily explain. And maybe that's the part that has lasted the longest. Some figures become clearer with time, but others like Bix Beiderbecke seem to move further away, leaving behind something that can still be heard, still be felt, but never completely understood. And along the Mississippi in Davenport, that story is still there, waiting to be listened to once again.